What happens when a casual late-night conversation suddenly shifts, and a single correction turns the entire tone of the room? On live television, where every word is amplified and every pause feels longer than it really is, even the smallest pushback can change everything. And that's exactly what unfolded the night Travis Kelce sat across from Jimmy Kimmel, when a light-hearted interview took an unexpected turn over an NFL rumor that refused to go away. Before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this aren't just entertainment, they reveal what really happens when celebrities are put on the spot in real time. It started like any other late-night appearance. The energy was relaxed. The audience was warm. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his dry humor and carefully timed questions, welcomed Travis Kelce with the kind of familiarity viewers have come to expect. Kelce, at the time, wasn't just an NFL star. He was one of the most recognizable faces in American sports. A Super Bowl champion, a dominant tight end, and increasingly, a personality who could hold his own far beyond the football field. But live television has a way of stripping away preparation. There are no second takes, no edits, no filters between the question and the reaction. And sometimes, what's meant to be playful can land differently when the stakes are higher than expected. The rumor itself had been circulating for days. It wasn't new in the world of sports media, where speculation often moves faster than confirmation. Still, it had picked up enough traction that it couldn't be ignored. Fans were talking. Commentators were debating. And by the time Kelce stepped onto that stage, the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Jimmy Kimmel did what seasoned hosts often do. He leaned into it. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The conversation flowed easily, moving between Kelce's recent performances, his off-field personality, and the growing spotlight around him. There were laughs. There were quick jokes. The audience responded exactly as expected. It was, by all appearances, another successful late-night segment. But underneath that surface, there was a question waiting to be asked. And when it finally came, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't aggressive. It was framed casually, almost as if it were just another talking point. But timing is everything. And in that moment, timing turned a simple question into something much more significant. Because Kelce didn't just answer it. He corrected it. That distinction, subtle as it may seem, changed everything. In interviews, especially on live television, celebrities are often expected to play along, to laugh off speculation, to sidestep anything that might create tension. It's part of the unspoken agreement between host and guest. But every now and then, that agreement is tested. And when it is, the result can be revealing. Kelce's response wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. But it was direct enough to shift the tone. For a brief moment, the rhythm of the conversation broke. The audience, sensing the change, grew quieter. Kimmel, experienced as he is, adjusted quickly, but even that adjustment carried a different energy. This wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a clarification. On live television, with no room to take it back. Moments like this don't happen often. Not because questions aren't asked, but because answers are usually controlled, managed, delivered in a way that keeps everything moving smoothly. But live broadcasts don't always allow for that level of control. And when someone chooses to push back, even slightly, it becomes noticeable. That's what made this moment stand out. It wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices, no dramatic walk-offs. But there was something else, something quieter, and arguably more powerful. A shift in control. A reminder that even in a setting designed for entertainment, authenticity can still break through. And for viewers watching at home, that authenticity is what lingers. Because it raises questions. Was the rumor misunderstood? Was it misrepresented? Or was this simply a case of a public figure deciding, in real time, to set the record straight? The answer wasn't immediately clear. And that uncertainty only added to the intrigue. As the interview continued, the conversation found its rhythm again. The laughs returned. The tension, at least on the surface, seemed to fade. But something had already changed. The moment had passed, but it hadn't disappeared. In fact, it had just begun. Because in the world of live television, a single exchange doesn't stay contained within the studio. It travels. It gets replayed, analyzed, discussed, and sometimes reinterpreted in ways no one could have predicted. For Travis Kelce, this wasn't just another interview. And for Jimmy Kimmel, it wasn't just another question. It was a reminder of how quickly things can shift when the script, spoken or unspoken, doesn't go exactly as planned. And what happened next would only make that clearer. Because behind that brief correction, there was a bigger story waiting to unfold. In the days leading up to that interview, the atmosphere around Travis Kelce had already begun to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that dominated headlines outright, but enough to create a subtle tension that followed him into every public appearance. Kelce wasn't just performing at an elite level on the field. He was evolving into something more, a crossover figure who moved seamlessly between sports, entertainment, and mainstream media. His visibility had expanded beyond football broadcasts into commercials, podcasts, and high-profile appearances. And with that visibility came something inevitable: increased scrutiny. In the NFL, rumors are part of the landscape. They move quickly, often fueled by speculation rather than confirmed information. Analysts debate them. Fans amplify them. Social media accelerates them. And before long, even the most uncertain claims can start to feel like established narratives. This particular rumor wasn't necessarily explosive, but it was persistent. It lingered in sports talk shows, appeared in headlines, and circulated online with just enough repetition to make it difficult to ignore. For someone in Kelce's position, that kind of attention creates a unique challenge. Address it, and you give it more oxygen. Ignore it, and it continues to grow on its own. So when Kelce agreed to appear on Jimmy Kimmel's show, the question wasn't whether the rumor would come up. It was how. Jimmy Kimmel, by that point, had built a reputation on his ability to blend humor with timely commentary. His interviews often walked a careful line, light enough to entertain, but sharp enough to stay relevant. He understood what audiences were already thinking about, and he knew how to bring those thoughts into the conversation without making it feel forced. But live television adds a layer of unpredictability that even the most experienced hosts can't fully control. There's a rhythm to late-night interviews, a structure that guides the conversation from one topic to the next. It starts with something easy: recent achievements, personal anecdotes, a few jokes to warm up the audience. Then, gradually, it moves toward more current or potentially sensitive topics. Not abruptly, but with enough subtlety that it feels natural. That structure was in place that night. Kelce entered the stage to applause, carrying the confidence that had become part of his public image. He was comfortable in front of the camera, engaged, quick to respond, the kind of guest who makes a host's job easier. But even in those opening moments, there were small signals, barely noticeable unless you were paying close attention. The way certain topics were acknowledged and then quickly moved past. The slight pauses before answering questions that touched on anything beyond the surface. Nothing overt. Nothing that would stand out to a casual viewer, but enough to suggest that there were boundaries being navigated in real time. The rumor itself sat just outside the conversation, like an unspoken presence. And that's where the pressure builds, not in the moment of confrontation, but in the moments leading up to it. Because every question that doesn't address it makes the eventual question feel more significant. Every laugh, every anecdote, every smooth transition adds contrast to what's coming next. It creates a sense of anticipation, even if the audience doesn't consciously recognize it. For Kelce, there was also the added layer of expectation. As an athlete, he was used to media interactions. Post-game interviews, press conferences, controlled environments where answers are often measured and concise. But late-night television operates differently. It's less formal, more conversational. And because of that, it can sometimes feel less predictable. There's an assumption that everything will stay light. Until it doesn't. Kimmel's approach, as always, was calculated. He didn't rush into the topic. He allowed the interview to breathe, built rapport, established a rhythm that made the audience feel at ease. And in doing so, he created the perfect conditions for a question that might otherwise feel out of place. That's what experienced hosts do. They don't force moments, they set them up. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the conversation around Kelce continued to evolve. Sports analysts debated the validity of the rumor. Fans speculated about its implications. Some dismissed it entirely. Others leaned into it, treating it as something worth watching. And that's the nature of modern media cycles. A story doesn't need to be confirmed to become relevant. It just needs attention. By the time the interview aired, that attention had reached a point where ignoring the rumor completely would have felt noticeable. Addressing it, however, came with its own risks. Because once it's brought into the conversation, it becomes part of the record. For Kelce, that meant any response, no matter how brief, would be heard, analyzed, and revisited. Every word would carry weight, not just in that moment, but afterward. And for Kimmel, the challenge was different. It wasn't about avoiding the topic. It was about navigating it in a way that aligned with the tone of the show while still acknowledging what viewers were already thinking about. That balance is delicate. Push too hard, and it risks creating discomfort. Stay too light, and it feels like something important is being avoided. The line between those two outcomes is thin, and on live television, there's no time to recalibrate once it's crossed. As the interview moved forward, the energy in the room remained steady. The audience responded to the humor. The conversation flowed. But beneath it all, the anticipation continued to build. Because eventually, the question would come. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about the rumor itself. It would be about how Kelce chose to respond to it. On a stage where every reaction is immediate, every pause is visible, and every word becomes part of a larger narrative. In that sense, the interview had already become more than just another appearance. It was a moment waiting to happen. And when that moment arrived, it would do more than interrupt the flow of conversation. It would redefine it. The moment didn't arrive with a dramatic shift in tone. There was no warning, no visible signal that the conversation was about to change direction. It came the same way most pivotal moments on live television do, quietly, almost casually, disguised as just another question. Jimmy Kimmel leaned slightly forward, maintaining the relaxed posture he had carried throughout the interview. His expression didn't harden, didn't signal confrontation. If anything, it remained consistent with the rhythm he had already established, measured, conversational, controlled. And then he brought it up. The rumor. Framed lightly, almost as if it was something already understood. Something that didn't need heavy explanation. The kind of phrasing that allows a guest to either laugh it off or engage with it, depending on how they choose to respond. For a split second, nothing changed. Travis Kelce sat in the same position, shoulders relaxed, expression neutral. But in live television, a second can stretch longer than it feels. And in that brief pause, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely, something shifted. It wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. Kelce didn't immediately laugh it off. He didn't deflect with humor. Instead, he gave a response that was direct enough to interrupt the expected flow, but controlled enough to avoid escalation. He corrected the premise. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Just clearly. And that distinction mattered. Because in that instant, the conversation moved from entertainment into clarification. The tone didn't collapse, but it tightened. The easy rhythm that had carried the interview up to that point slowed, just enough for the audience to register that something different was happening. Kimmel, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He let Kelce speak, maintained eye contact, listened. But even in that composed exchange, there were subtle signals. A slight shift in posture, a brief pause before the next line. The kind of micro-adjustments that only happen when a conversation moves off its expected path. Kelce's words were measured. He didn't expand beyond what was necessary. He didn't turn it into a broader statement. He simply addressed the rumor as it had been presented and corrected it. No added commentary. No visible frustration. Just a clear distinction between what had been said publicly and what he was willing to confirm on air. The audience response was immediate, but restrained. A few scattered reactions, some surprised, some unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. It wasn't the kind of moment that triggered loud applause or overt discomfort. Instead, it created something more subtle, awareness. Everyone in the room understood that the tone had shifted. Kimmel responded with a quick adjustment. A small acknowledgement, something that allowed the conversation to continue without lingering too heavily on the correction. It was the kind of pivot that experienced hosts rely on in live settings. Recognize the moment, then move forward. But even as the interview resumed, the energy wasn't exactly the same. The laughter returned, but it carried a slightly different weight. The pacing picked up again, but there was a trace of caution in how topics were introduced. Not enough to disrupt the show, but enough to suggest that both sides were now more aware of the boundaries. That's what makes live television moments like this so distinct. There's no rewind. No opportunity to reshape what's already been said. Once the words are out, they exist in real time, shared between the people in the room and the viewers watching from a distance. And in that space, even a brief correction can carry significance. Kelce didn't revisit the point. He didn't elaborate further or attempt to redirect attention back to it. Once he had made the clarification, he let it stand. The conversation moved on, transitioning into safer territory, career highlights, light humor, familiar ground. But the moment didn't disappear. It lingered in the pauses between questions, in the slight changes in tone, in the awareness that something unscripted had just occurred. Kimmel, maintaining his role, kept the interview moving. His delivery remained steady, professional. But even in that steadiness, there was an acknowledgement, unspoken, but present, that the conversation had briefly stepped outside its intended boundaries. That's the balance of live interviews. They are designed to feel natural, but they are rarely without structure. And when that structure is disrupted, even slightly, it becomes noticeable, not because of what's said, but because of how it changes everything around it. For viewers watching at home, the moment may have passed quickly. A question, an answer, a transition. But for those paying closer attention, it stood out, because it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't packaged. It was real. And that authenticity, brief as it was, created a different kind of impact. Not the kind that dominates headlines immediately. Not the kind that sparks instant controversy. But the kind that stays with an audience, prompting a second look. A replay. A closer listen to what was actually said. As the segment approached its conclusion, the tone had largely stabilized. The interview ended on a familiar note, light, engaging, consistent with the format viewers expected. Applause filled the studio. The conversation wrapped cleanly. But the earlier moment remained part of it. Unedited, unfiltered, and undeniably present. Because in live television, it only takes a few seconds to change the entire dynamic of a conversation. And once that happens, everything that follows carries a trace of it, whether acknowledged or not. In the immediate seconds after the interview wrapped, the studio responded the way it always does. Applause rose, the band played, and the cameras prepared to transition. On the surface, everything looked routine. Another successful segment completed, another guest appearance checked off. But live television doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. Because what happens in those unscripted moments doesn't stay contained within the studio. It moves outward, into clips, into conversations, into analysis. And in this case, that brief exchange between Travis Kelce and Jimmy Kimmel began to take on a life of its own almost immediately. Inside the room, the energy had subtly shifted. It wasn't tension in the traditional sense. There was no visible conflict, no awkward silence hanging in the air after the segment ended. But there was awareness. The kind that comes from recognizing that something unscripted had just occurred, and that it had been seen by millions in real time. Kimmel maintained his composure throughout. As a host, that's part of the job. No matter how a moment unfolds, the responsibility is to keep the show moving, to ensure that the tone remains intact. And he had done exactly that. He acknowledged the correction, adjusted his approach, and guided the conversation forward without allowing it to stall. That ability, to adapt instantly, without breaking the flow, is what separates experienced hosts from everyone else. But even with that control, the moment couldn't be undone. For Kelce, the impact was different. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged the host in a confrontational way. But by choosing to correct the rumor directly, on air, he had done something that carries weight in media appearances. He set a boundary. And he did it in real time. That decision changed how the interview was perceived afterward. Not dramatically, not in a way that turned it into controversy, but enough to shift the narrative from a standard late-night appearance to something more noteworthy. Within hours, clips of the exchange began circulating. Short segments, replayed and shared across platforms, focusing not on the entire interview, but on that specific moment. The question, the pause, the correction. Viewers dissected it in different ways. Some saw it as a straightforward clarification, an athlete addressing misinformation directly. Others focused on the subtle change in tone, reading into the body language, the pacing, the brief disruption in rhythm. Media outlets picked it up as well, not as a major incident, but as a moment worth noting. In a landscape where interviews are often predictable, even a small deviation stands out. And that's what this was, a deviation. Not from professionalism, not from composure, but from expectation. Because late-night interviews are built on a kind of unspoken agreement. The host brings up relevant topics. The guest responds in a way that keeps the conversation engaging and accessible. Most of the time, that balance holds. But when a guest chooses to correct rather than entertain, to clarify rather than deflect, that balance shifts, even if only briefly. And audiences notice. For Kelce, the long-term impact wasn't defined by controversy. It wasn't the kind of moment that reshaped his career or altered his public image in a dramatic way, but it added a layer to how he was perceived, not just as an athlete or a personality, but as someone willing to address narratives directly when given the opportunity. That distinction matters in a media environment where speculation often moves faster than fact. For Kimmel, the moment reinforced something equally important. The nature of live television is unpredictable, no matter how experienced the host. Questions can land differently than intended. Responses can shift the tone. And the ability to navigate those shifts without losing control of the conversation is a skill that has to be applied in real time. He didn't avoid the topic. He didn't escalate it. He adapted. And that adaptation is what allowed the interview to continue without turning a brief correction into something larger than it needed to be. As time passed, the moment settled into a different kind of significance. It wasn't replayed endlessly as a dramatic confrontation. It didn't become a defining controversy. Instead, it remained what it had always been, an authentic, unscripted exchange that revealed how quickly the dynamics of a live interview can change. And why those changes matter. Because in an era of edited content, curated responses, and carefully managed public appearances, live television still holds something unique: unpredictability. There's no delay, no revision, no second version, just a question and an answer. And sometimes that's enough. The exchange between Travis Kelce and Jimmy Kimmel didn't rely on volume or conflict to make an impact. It relied on timing, on clarity, on the decision, in a single moment, to correct rather than conform. And that's what continues to resonate. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Because it showed that even in an environment designed for entertainment, truth still has a place. Even if it only takes a few seconds to surface. And those few seconds can change how an entire conversation is remembered. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, like the video, share your perspective in the comments, and pass this along to others who appreciate real, unfiltered moments from live television.